Hello and good morning, everybody. It's Jeremiah. We have a webinar on a really fun little technique, and you're in for a treat. I was going to go over a couple quick housekeeping things, and we'll get going here. As you probably saw on the little preview slide, this is being recorded, so that'll be great. You'll be able to watch this again and again. And there is a Q&A button at the bottom. I recommend you go ahead and just click it now. Get that situated on the screen so it's a little quicker for you to type in your questions. But also note that you'll be able to see the answered questions that other people type in. So it's just a really good companion while you're watching the webinar. Lastly, I like to click that little view options at the top of the screen if I need to get to exit full screen mode, just in case I need to answer an important email or something, but no, you should stay in full screen mode, get immersed in this. This is a really good technique. We had a lot of fun prepping for this. So without any further ado, I'm gonna get this all handed over to Paul.
Alrighty, thank you, Jeremiah. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Let me just get my slides going here. Okay, my name is Paul, as Jeremiah already said, and I'll be narrating today's webinar on exploded isometric projections. And I think today is going to be pretty easygoing and a bit shorter than some of our other webinars. So if you have any questions about anything that I'm going to be showing, don't hesitate to ask. I will be stopping about halfway through to answer some questions if there are any, and then we'll have some time at the end. Probably a bit of time at the end to answer any questions. So here's our outline for the day. I'm just going to start off with some quick definitions and a few examples, and then I'll kind of go into what I did to set up before this presentation, and then we'll move into SketchUp and then Photoshop, and then I'm going to give a second demonstration on using just basically Photoshop and exports from CAD. So what is an isometric projection? It's just a way to represent a three-dimensional object in 2 dimensions. This example here clearly shows what it is. It lacks perspective, so as elements move further in the distance, they don't get smaller, they stay the same. And it's an axonometric type of drawing, which is that lacks perspective. But then a rule for isometric projections is that the Z and the Y axes have 60 degrees between them, and 60 degrees between the X and Y axes. And an exploded isometric projection is just a isometric drawing that has been basically created in layers and then spread apart so that you can clearly see whatever different layers of the isometric are working together. And so when using this with landscape architecture or landscape design, it has a few benefits. One being that you can clearly portray different layers of the landscape and pull them apart so that you can see how they are as a isolated isometric drawing, but then also sort of how they fit together almost like a puzzle, and that relationship between those different elements. And it's really good for both diagrammatical and conceptual graphics. Some examples that I've come across in various magazines or presentations that use isometric projections that are exploded, showing, say, grading as a layer, the difference between soft and hardscapes, circulation patterns is a very popular one. I've also seen existing isometric drawings with the proposed design as a layer above it. And then an interesting one that I just came across is showing different seasonal colors for planting. So here's a few that I just found in Landscape Architecture magazine. And I apologize for the quality of the images. I took these with my phone. But on the left here, we got a diagrammatical mapping of safe pedestrian crossing in an urban setting. It shows the relationship of time and distance of crossing. And then on the right, we have just a master plan that's been exploded to show your various built elements and everything that's involved with that master plan. And then here's that seasonal color that I came across here on the right, showing the different seasons and the planting and the different color involved. So what are we going to do today? We're going to try to achieve these two graphics here. Pretty simple, something that we could fit into this hour-long window. And on the left here, we're going to be basically creating the ISO drawing in SketchUp and then moving into Photoshop with the different layers and pulling them apart to get that effect. And then if you don't like SketchUp, or if you just want to do a real quick version of this drawing type, I'm going to show you how to just do it from CAD into straight into Photoshop to get a very simple kind of isometric projection. So before we get started, I did take a few steps to get to the point that we will be starting at. First, I exported my design from CAD, which is just this very simple planting plan and basically like a little park that I threw together, and I exported the layers and the design into SketchUp using our SketchUp connection. And I took those elements and I organized them into layers, as you can see on the right. And this is going to make basically organizing the visibility of different items easy to manage. And if you'd like to learn all about our SketchUp connection and basically what I did to get to this point, go ahead and check out our Basics for SketchUp 3D Connection webinar that Jake did last month or a year ago. So let's move into SketchUp. Here we are, our simple plan. Already set up. Here you can see my layers. And what I've done, I've just basically selected these items and I've put them onto these layers so that if I wanted to isolate just the planting, I can undo all of these other layers and I just have the planting. Or if I want to show just the circulation, I can undo everything but that. So that's going to be super important in the workflow here. And one thing to notice is that I created this borderline layer, and it's just this black line that surrounds the design. And the reason I did that, and I'm going to export these in all the different layers, so it'll be apparent in each of my different isometric layers. And yeah, the reason for that is so that it basically creates a visual reference that ties in the different layers together. If you don't have, say, a reference like that, and you just export the, or if you just have a layer with just the planting and no border, you're going to basically see, plants floating in space. And so having that visual reference tying the different layers together is key. And there's a couple of different ways you can do that. So it's not necessary that you do the borderline. It's just something that I want to do. So to get started in creating our exploded graphic, we need to set this up as an isometric projection, which is easy enough to do in SketchUp. We have our axes here as a visual reference, but SketchUp will basically do it for you. First thing you want to do is kind of figure out which angle you want to start at. So you can rotate and have the different isometric views depending on what rotation you have. So I kind of like this view here. It's pretty close to getting those angles for my axes. So I'm going to just kind of rotate my drawing to as close to as the point that I actually want to show it. So once you get that done, go ahead and go to your camera dropdown and turn on parallel projection. And what that does is that takes away that perspective that you need for an axonometric drawing. And then go down to camera again and click on standard views and choose ISO. And there you go. The hard part of setting this up is already done. You got your perfect isometric projection here. And notice that if you zoom in or if you press H to use the hand key or the hand tool, you can move this around and zoom in and out, and it's not going to affect the viewing angle. So you can still set up your scene that way, but you want to make sure not to rotate whatsoever. Okay, now that we've set up our ISO, we just want to stylize this so it's easy to work with before exporting out the layers. So with everything turned on, I want to set up first my style. So I'm going to go to Window and go down to Styles and open up my Styles Manager. And I don't like this green background. Sure, in Photoshop you can probably just cut that out, but I just want to skip that altogether. So I'll click Edit and then go to Background and click on the background color. And I'm just going to make it white. Like that. And then I want to add a couple more items to this. One being shadows. And if your shadows don't look great right off the bat, open up your Shadows Manager, which is in Window again, and do some adjustments here. Basically, the display is on the ground, so it's just going to be throwing the shadows onto the, if the ground was flat, it would actually be showing fine. But since I have modeled terrain, I did some grading here. I actually want to display on the faces and not on the ground, so that the shadows somewhat appropriately react to the variation in the terrain. And then you can adjust your sliders to get the different intensities of shadow versus light, and also the time of day. But that looks good for now. So we can close that. And then I want to turn on fog. You don't have to do this. I like to do this because we're working in a non-perspective drawing, and adding fog kind of gives that hint of distance. So when you have things further away, it gets a little more faded due to the fog setting. So turning that on still gives you that feeling of perspective without actually having any proper perspective lines. So turn on fog. Once again, if you want to make adjustments to how your fog looks, go to Window, click on fog, and you can adjust how intense that fog is and what color you want it to be. So I just want a slight fade towards the back. That's fine. And before we start setting up our scenes, I just want to zoom in so that my border is not cut off by the window here. But I want to zoom in far enough so I can get some detail in this image. So I'm going to stick with this and start setting up scenes. The first scene that I'm going to set up is an overall scene that shows everything we have in the graphic. And then I'm going to go to View, down to Animation, and Add Scene. And when you create the scene, you'll get this little scene notification up here. And what that does is that saves the visibility of layers, the style, your shadow settings, everything like that. So even if I were to accidentally rotate, I can click on my scene, and it's going to place the camera precisely back where it was. So now I basically have my overall scene. And if you want to name it, you can go to Window and open up your Scenes Manager. And then you have some more scene settings here. I'm just going to leave them all checked. And you can actually name the scene. So my overall scene is now saved. And so what I want to do, I want to work from the ground up, and I want to create a layer just for the called grading. And it's just going to be the ground plane. So I'm going to go to my layers, and I'm going to turn off all the layers except for my ground layer and my borderline. I want the borderline. and making sure not to rotate or move my model around in any way. I'm going to add a scene. It's just called ground plane. Okay. And from there, just continue this process for all of your different layers. I'm going to have a circulation layer just showing some pathways in the road. So now I'm going to go to add scene, saved, and now I'm going to do one more for planting. It's not going to let you turn off any layers that are currently active. So switch that, and then you can turn off the visibility for that. Now planting does have elements on different layers. That's fine. But I just want to isolate everything that is planting and then add one more scene and call it planting. Okay, so now I have 4 different scenes. So that if I click on overall, I've got everything, ground plane, circulation. Oh, it does look like I moved a little bit. Okay, so with circulation, I did move the model ever so slightly. So let's go back and update these. So notice that when I switch, the model moves. That is something that we don't want. So ground plane is fine. I'm going to now adjust my layers. I can't tell if it's moving. Okay, it's not moving. And redo my circulation. Okay. So I'm just going to delete the circulation scene. And then one more for planting. Okay, scene 5 and 6 are circulation and planting. I believe I can just delete this. Yep, right click on it and you can delete these errant scenes. Okay, and if you accidentally go over any of these scenes, you can right click on and update. So scene 5 is now my circulation scene. There's no movement. It does have the ground, which I don't want. Okay, update scene. So should, oh, well, that seems odd. Okay, either way, we can also just, once we have the scene set up, just export after adjusting our layers. So make sure scene 6 is our planting. Okay, so let's start exporting our images. I'm going to start with the overall image. Once you're ready to export, just go to File, Export 2D Graphic. And let's go to our correct folder. And I have a folder for SketchUp exports, and I'm going to start exporting these as different images. And I'm going to use JPEG in this example, but you can choose whatever image file type you like. So this is the overall layer, export. And it's just going to take a snapshot of what's in the window. And let's go to our ground plane, which still looks good. And export this as a 2D graphic. And just call it ground plane. Okay, and then the same thing for our circulation. And finally for planting. Okay, so we have basically completed what we need to do in SketchUp for this demonstration. Let's move into Photoshop. Let's just go here and go to the exports file. And I'm going to first just open up the overall image with Photoshop. This is just going to be kind of my base here. Give myself some room. Okay, so let's first adjust the canvas size so that we can accommodate the other layers. So to do that, just go up to Image and Canvas Size. Alternatively, you can press Command-Alt-C or Control-Alt-C. And it's going to give you the current canvas size. We basically just want to make it about twice as tall to accommodate 3 more layers. So the current height is 50 inches. Let's go up to, let's do just 50 more inches. Actually, let's do 100. That should accommodate it, what we need. And click OK. Of course, you should do height and not width. Okay. Here we go. Anchor it to the bottom so it goes up. And now we have our canvas resized, and take our paint dump tool and paint the background white. And now we could drop in our other images here. So let's go to planting, ground plane, and circulation, select those and drop them in. Okay, I'm just pressing enter because they should be appropriately sized already. And I'm just going to do a little organization in my layers, starting with the ground plane on the bottom, go to circulation, and then planting up top. And before we move anything, I want basically the white pixels to be transparent. So I'm going to select these layers and change this drop down for blending to multiply. So now I can adjust using the move tool. The quick key is V, and start pulling down my different layers. Put the ground plane right there, circulation right there, and planting up here. While I drag, I am holding the shift key so I get a perfect vertical movement. And then I just kind of want these equally spaced. Okay. So that's how we get that exploded axonometric or isometric drawing. There's a couple things we can do to kind of touch this up. First, we'll want to rasterize our layers because they'll be set as smart objects and uneditable. Notice that there's some graying here as they overlap. So we can just take our paint bucket tool and start, make sure contiguous is on, and just start filling in those kind of gray pixels with the white. Just some basic cleaning steps here. Okay. And I'm just going to show a couple more things on this demonstration to help sort of guide your eyes to know that this is all the same image here. And I've noticed in a lot of these types of drawings, they have like a dashed line connecting either the corners or different elements in the landscape, kind of showing where they are fitting in with the other layers. And certainly you can do this almost exact same workflow in Illustrator. And that might even be optimal because you can create vector-based line work, which is going to be just a little bit better for making these types of lines. But I didn't want to throw in another piece of software into this presentation. So in Photoshop, we can still create our dashed lines, though probably suggest using Illustrator for this. So what we want to do for creating a dashed line is create a new layer, and I'm just going to call it lines. And I'm going to go to my brush tool. B is the short key. And then I'm going to turn on my brush settings here. It's the little folder and brush icon. And it's going to pull open my brush settings. What I want to do is find a brush that is square or rectangular. So if I scroll down, trying to find just a hard square brush. There we go. I know there's a set in here. I have a lot of brushes preloaded into my brush library. Huh. Okay, well, these seem to be some previously used ones. So let's just take our hard square brush, bring down the pixels to, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10, depending on the actual size of the drawing. And to get that dash look, we're going to go down to the spacing, and we're going to drag this all the way up to, I think, about 250, 300 is kind of the sweet spot for these lines. Notice you have a preview of what the line's going to look like down here. So that if we draw a line in our image, let's zoom in a bit, make our lives a little easier. That's pretty good. I'm going to make it a little bigger, maybe about 15 pixels and a little more spacing. There. And once we have our brush set up for making our dashed lines, turn on your rulers if you don't already have them on. I already have them on, but if you didn't, you can go to View and check the rulers option there. Reason being, once you have your rulers showing here on the sides, you can click and drag your rulers and create guides, which is going to make drawing these horizontal and vertical lines much, much easier. When they cross each other, they create little snap points. So if you click near them, it's going to kind of snap to that intersection. So I'm just going to create a couple of guidelines here. And basically my goal is just to the dashed lines connecting the corners to really further demonstrate that these are all connected in the same pieces of the same landscape. So once I have my intersections, go ahead and click on this corner, hold down the Shift key, and just drag down until you get to here. If you go a little too far like I did, go ahead and take out your eraser and clean it up. draw my dash line down, holding the shift key. And let's do one in front. Okay, if you hit Control or Command and the colon key, that's going to turn off your guides quickly, or hide them rather. And so we have nice little guidelines, and I like to drop the opacity of this layer down quite a bit so they're not as bold or distracting in the overall graphic. And then just real quick, let's add some little descriptive blurbs to the side here. So I'm going to make a little more room on the right, change my canvas size again, anchor it on the left, and change the width. Let's see, it's at 105 inches. Let's add 50 more inches over. And this is a really, really big drawing. Definitely bigger than it needs to be. So you can certainly take the image size down a bit to whatever you're going to be working with. And let's go back to our lines. And I'm just going to quickly draw some lines out so you can add little descriptive blurbs to each of these layers. Once again, turning on my guidelines, I'm just going to click and paint some dashed lines. Let's see what's going on here. Okay, there we go. It looked hidden. So draw over, and it's going to pretty much just snap to this line as I get close to it. Okay, so now we have our little leaders. Something I like to do with these graphics is create or take out some icons. Maybe I have some icons for each of these different layers, which is kind of fun. I've seen this in quite a few of these drawings. So I just made these quick little icons, starting with some icons that I found on a free icon finder website. So if we zoom in, we can see what they are. The first one is it's like the side of a mountain, stands for terrain. I have my plants icon here. I'm just going to drag this up and place that there. And then I have my little pedestrian guy to represent the circulation. And then from here, you can take out your text tool and add names for each of these layers. That's this T here. And just call it, say, the planting layer. For some reason, it's coming in green. And adjust the size. And then whatever information you want to put in there, any notes and kind of call outs, you can just do that. Something that'd be kind of cool is actually exporting a PDF of our, say, planting schedule. So you get an actual list of all the plants that are in this layer, putting that right there. Maybe you do a rough notes schedule for the circulation, or maybe you have a hardscape layer. Just placing those in there, super quick way of basically adding notes to each of these layers. So I pretty much demonstrated everything I wanted to do with this graphic, and we are going to move on to a just CAD and Photoshop workflow. So before we do that, I want to stop and take questions on anything that we've covered so far. So
yeah. You know, we had a quick statement from Susan just saying that she likes to draw dashed lines in Photoshop with the line tool and sets the stroke option to dashed.
mm-hmm.
So that was just that. And just that, oh, you know, Wells had a question about if this is, you know, would also apply to Revit. And I believe the workflow would essentially be the same. I just can't vouch for the exporting the 2D graphic from Revit, but otherwise I think they're the same. But otherwise, keep on trucking.
Alrighty. I have not played with the ISO settings in Revit or much of the 2D exporting. I imagine that capability is there, but I can't say for sure. And yeah, the line tool will also give you these nice lines. And I just, for some reason, have issues with the line tool that are more of a personal thing. But certainly they make more dynamic lines, whereas these are just pixels made with the paintbrush. So let's move on to Photoshop here. If we go back to my slideshow. To begin things, the setup that I've done is the workflow that I showed in this webinar that I gave a while back using Photoshop and post-production renderings. And basically what I've done is I've organized my layers into layer groups and then exported various PDF documents with different layers of different visibility of items in the landscape. So just like I did with SketchUp, I basically exported a PDF for the overall graphic, the ground plane, circulation pattern, and the planting. And once again, I made a border line around as a reference. For this, I did a perfect square because it's going to help demonstrate that I'm getting the correct angles when I'm actually making that. It's called a false isometric. And so here's the 4 different PDFs that I exported. Notice the square around each one, making sure that they're all consistent. So let's get into it. And then what I've done is I've pulled them all into Photoshop. And they're all just different layers. So it looks very similar to how I had pulled in my images from SketchUp, but it's flat. So we need to basically transform these layers so that they give that isometric projection look. And so how do we do that? I was able to play around this for a bit, and I figured out a nice little workflow for it. What you want to do is, after you have your layers in here, select all the layers at once. You can just click and hold Shift and click on the furthest layer from that. And start by hitting the V key, or alternatively the transform tool, which is Control or Command T. I just hit V for move. And what move does is it gives you these grip points around the edges. And if you float above one of the corners, you'll get the nice little arced arrows there, and you can rotate this. And so I just want to rotate this 45 degrees in a direction that I want to be working with. So in this case, I'm actually going to go in this direction. Actually, let's go this direction. Yeah, so negative 45 degree angle rotate. I was holding the Shift key when I rotated. That way you get nice, it basically snaps to every, I think, 15 degrees as you rotate, all the way up to 45. And once you've done this, press Enter to end it. You don't want to move on to the next step without pressing Enter first. And notice my canvas is not quite fitting everything on here. So I actually want to just adjust the canvas ever so slightly. Let's say by 4 inches on each side. And actually, I'll adjust the height of the canvas now to accommodate for that exploded layer view. So I want to actually add, let's say, 10 inches to the height. So we should have plenty of room on the sides, and then hopefully the height is enough room there. And I'm just going to fill in my empty pixels on the background layer with white. Okay, and now back to our 4 layers. We still need to transform them, basically flatten them a little bit so that they give that 3D look. And so select all the layers once again, And you can go back to the V key or the move tool where you have these grip points, or you can use the transform tool. If you are using the move tool, which is V, just click on one of the grips. Don't hold down, just click once. And you'll get your transformation controls back up here. And what you want to do here is uncheck this chain link icon and then adjust the height percentage. And the percentage that I found that is pretty much perfect for getting you the angles you want for the isometric is 58%. Just like that, and then press enter when you're done. And now you have your projection here. So if I were to compare this to like a reference image, this angle here is 30 degrees. So now that we've got that set up, we just need to go ahead and do our pulling apart once again. I'm going to pull everything down to the bottom and then start by selecting the 3 layers above, hold the shift key down and move it up. I'm going to go not so far this time. Move on to circulation and planting and bring those up, holding the shift key. It looks like we might need a little more room up top. And then planting. So let's adjust our canvas once again. What should we give it? Maybe another 5 to 10 inches? How about 10, just to be safe? Okay, fill in our background. And there we have it. A very, very quick way to make a ISO explosion in Photoshop. Now it is very flat. So if you are looking to get kind of that 3D feel, you can kind of fake that. And I went through this workflow in more detail in the Photoshop post-rendering webinar part 3. So go check that out for a little more detail on what I'm doing here. But if you wanted to add some 3D elements to it, you can basically take some stock images. These stock photos are, once again, they're provided by Tony Textures at tonytextures.com. And you can drag these in. Maybe you want to make these yourself. Cutouts of the trees. And you can start placing them over the actual planting layer or whatever layer that you're working on. Press enter after you're sizing it. Command J or Control J will duplicate the layer. And so you can just keep on duplicating as you move around. Typically you want to start in the background and move forward, because as you make a new layer, it's going to wind up on top. So if you have some in the background, your above layer should actually be in front. And pull these down and just start filling in all your plants. Pretty simple there. What I like to do is, once I have all of one type of tree or plant or item placed, I'll select them all. That's holding down the shift and clicking on the different layers, and then hitting Control or Command E, and that merges the layers together. So now they're all just one layer. Or you can group each individual tree into layer groups, however you want to manage that. And so if you then take away your planting layer, you still have your sort of false 3D image there. Another thing you can do is, say you want to still keep that border, you can mask out these plants here by adding a mask to this layer. If you select the layer and then select this icon here, creates a mask. So you can then make a selection around these items on the layer and fill with black. And if you fill with black, it's basically going to mask out those items. So now you retain this border and you've masked out those other plants. And then if you want to add some shadow to this, there's a couple ways you can do that. You can add a drop shadow Or what I like to do, just if you want to be very quick about it, is make a duplicate of the layer, and then just do a Control T, and just kind of hold down the Shift key and flatten it down a bit. Go through and just erase these tree trunks. And then head up to Image and Hue and Saturation. There's a couple ways to do this, but basically make these totally black, and then go up to Filter and throw a Gaussian blur onto it. Maybe not so drastic. Just kind of like that. And then drop the opacity down, and then bring that layer, call it Tree Shadows, down below the cutout trees. So a quick way to kind of get those shadows there. So here's an example that I just did this morning real quick, and I replaced all the plants in the planting plan. Doing this probably took me 10 minutes. So it really doesn't take that long. It really depends on how detailed you want to go, and also how big the landscape is. So you can still get that kind of 3D look when just using CAD and Photoshop. And that's it. So if there are any more questions on this workflow or anything you want me to demonstrate, I can do that.
Yeah, everybody, come on, get some questions in, because there aren't any right now. So while maybe people are thinking and typing, I will reiterate what you said. Also, any other similar techniques that people might want to see in a future webinar. You know, this one really grew out of some of the last ones that Paul did, and we just kind of kept going, hey, here's another neat technique we could show. All right, I guess I don't see any questions coming in, so let's just call that good, get to lunch, and hey, everybody, have a great weekend.
Yeah, so yeah, it was a pretty simple workflow. I understand why there's no questions. And I kept it simple just to kind of show this technique. But if there is a desire for, say, more detail on this workflow, or something like this, where we can spend a little more time just really getting into the nitty-gritty details of you know, maybe photorealism or a certain style, certainly send us some emails or requests, and we can look into that. And with that, I am going to take off, and everybody have a lovely weekend. And thank you. Goodbye.